She spent most of her legal career as a litigator, first as an assistant public defender in Maryland for 8 years, and as an assistant state's attorney for Prince George's County, Maryland. She spent almost 19 years prosecuting child abuse, sexual assault, and most importantly, human trafficking crimes. Welcome, Renee Battle-Brooks.
Thank you so much. How's everyone today? All right. Thank you for coming to spend a Saturday, a beautiful Saturday with us here. I'm glad that it's small and intimate because we really want to foster a lot of discussion once our panelists have been able to present. So I would love, and I'm honored to introduce our panelists. We have immediately to my right the Honorable Judge Rohulamin Quander. He was a DC Senior Administrative Law Judge and Director of the Quander Historical and Educational Society, and he's the author of The Quander Quality. So please give him a hand. And next to Judge Quander is Wayne Lawson. He is a 30-year employee of the federal government, so he brings lots of wisdom through that lens, and he's in his final year of law school and participating in the Youth Justice Clinic as a student attorney at the University of the District of Columbia Law School. So welcome. And last but certainly not least is Delegate Nicole Williams. She is a DC native and represents Maryland's 22nd District in the Maryland General Assembly. It covers several major towns on the heart of Prince George's County. And she has represented District 22 since being sworn in on December 6, 2019. So welcome, Delegate. So we always like to start off panels with sort of laying the foundation. And we have asked each of our panelists to give us a little bit of their insight on the arc of slavery to mass incarceration. So we will start with the Honorable Judge Quander.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon. Be careful what you say with a live mic. May come back to haunt you later. I am Rohulamin Quander, and proud graduate of Howard University School of Law. And you know, as well as Howard University undergrad. And I'm glad that this event does not conflict with homecoming, which was last week. A question of freedom. The book title, which is based right here primarily in Prince George's County, Maryland, from which the Quander ancestry was enslaved at another time in Charles and Prince George's, and likewise in the Fairfax County, Alexandria area. When we look at the arc of freedom from where it came in the institution of enslavement to where it is today, the more it has changed, the more it has remained the same. We look at people of Africa, well, we weren't so much focused on Native American nor so much on Latino Americans, so the focus is clear on African American, although much of what I am saying or will say is likewise applicable to some extent to other minorities, so we set that stage from the beginning. We look at the institution of enslavement, which is an incarceration, forced incarceration for hundreds of thousands and millions of people in this country, of which there were maybe 100,000 overall or close to it in the state of Maryland. And we come up to the 21st century, we come through the period of Jim Crow and segregation and the drug wars and the forced apartheid, the separation that is imposed upon us. We end up with a statistic which is very, very dubious and focused on the state of Maryland. Did anybody see the front page of the Washington Post today? Yes, you know where I'm going. Anybody else see it? Well, we are in the right place at the right time, or maybe the wrong place at the right time. Hold on. Whenever I'm about to be a part of something, I always look in the paper to see, well, is there anything analogous that came up within the recent past that relates to what we are about to do? What did I see on page 1? Maryland takes on racial disparity in prisons. I invite you to read the Metro section today of the Washington Post if you have access to it. I'm not going to read the article, I promise you. But the statistics are shocking, where you find out that Maryland has the highest ratio of African Americans incarcerated in relation to the other populations in the United States. I would have thought, I repeat that.
Yes.
Maryland has the highest ratio of incarcerations of African Americans in relation to the white population of any state in the United States. You ask the man on the street, he or she would probably tell you of a state in the Deep South. They probably would. And they go on in this same article, again, I'm not going to bore you with those statistics. It's so improportionate. 73% of the incarcerated people in Maryland are African American males, and 53% of the incarcerated women in the state of Maryland are female. So this gives you an idea of where we are. Now, before today, we had a Zoom meeting to prepare ourselves for meeting each other, etc., because we just met in person today for the first time. We talked about some of the same things. What are we going to do about it? How are we facing this issue today? And I'll get into it later, but when we give everybody else a chance to introduce themselves. But I don't like to speak off the cuff, especially when I'm a judge. I know I'm supposed to do something based on what was done before. Even if I disagree with it, I have to have some rational reason for making the distinction. So I said, let me consult some sources, and we're going to talk about that shortly. Where did I look? I looked at the William Brennan Institute. He was on the Supreme Court. I looked at, that was one place I looked. I looked at the United Nations to see if they had anything to say about it. And I looked at another Justice Institute, the name of which is buried in my papers. And they all had meaningful suggestions. Incidentally, somebody else has been reading that, because the article that appeared in the Washington Post today touches on the exact same things that are hopeful remedies. So we'll talk about that, but I want to give my fellow classmates a chance to say something. I don't want them to say I stole all of their thunder. So I'll pass it away.
Thank you, Judge Quander.
Thank you, Judge. Again, my name is Wayne Lawson. As our moderator stated, this is my 30th year working for the federal government. I had lots of experience dealing with the carceral system as a part of that, as part of my employment. What I wanted to talk a little bit about was in terms of the arc of slavery and how that is associated with mass incarceration. From my standpoint, it begins with the 13th Amendment, which states that neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as punishment for a crime where the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States or any place subject to its jurisdiction. Congress shall have the power to enforce through appropriate legislation. And so what that basically is stating is that if you are convicted of a crime, you can be required to work. You can be an indentured servant. You can be, quote unquote, slave. Now, the question is, what does that mean today, right? Slavery today does not mean the same thing that slavery meant in prior to the enactment of the 13th Amendment. In the Dred Scott case, really, which is the only Supreme Court case which talks about slavery, that case is prior to the 13th Amendment. And what that case basically states is that slaves have no rights. Slaves are property, right? And what we know after the 13th Amendment is that individuals have rights. They have the right to property. And so the question is, what does that mean? How do we understand slavery today as distinct from what slavery meant prior to the enactment of the 13th Amendment? And I think that understanding that will help us to chart a path forward to understand how we unwind this ball with a carceral system that is truly excellent at framing the narrative.
Yeah.
And so we'll talk more about that as we move forward.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Mr. Lawson. Delegate.
Sure. Thank you so much for having me. As was stated earlier, I'm Delegate Nicole Williams. I serve on the Judiciary Committee in the Maryland General Assembly. I'm also an attorney by trade as well. And so one of the things I think I want to kind of touch on is really the role of government in this entire process, and more specifically kind of as it relates to Maryland, the role of the General Assembly. And so I was fortunate to run into a friend of mine a couple days ago, John Peter Thompson, who's here, and we had a really interesting conversation about the first slave rebellion here in Prince George's County, the Jack Ransom slave rebellion that occurred in the 1700s, actually, here in Prince George's County. It happened a little southwest of Upper Marlboro, Maryland, and at that time, there wasn't really a court system in Maryland as we know it today. Really, the General Assembly was the court system back then. And so John Ransom was arrested and was tried by 12 men, though I doubt it was a jury of his peers per se at that time, but there was a jury. And after he was found guilty of the charges that were brought before him, and at that time, after 2 days of the depositions that were read by the counsel, the governor, Governor Ogle, issued a proclamation ordering all officers as well as all civil and military within this province to be careful, to be particularly careful in putting certain laws into place in relates to the execution. So he was executed. Men were executed, if I recall correctly, by hanging, not necessarily the hangings that we're accustomed to seeing from the late 1800s, early 1900s by a rope, but hanging nevertheless. And women who were found guilty back then were subject to be burned at the stake. Sounds familiar. Which later changed, and it started with the governor issuing this proclamation to modify the way that people were penalized, because there was a situation that happened in Talbot County where a woman was found guilty of a charge and was ordered hung by the state, burned by the state. But they weren't really certain about the process. They had never had to do that before in Talbot County, and it went horribly wrong. And so at that point, then the General Assembly of Maryland issued some laws to try to make the execution a bit more humane, in the sense of not doing it on the public right-of-way, and no longer burning at the stake, but hanging was still allowed nevertheless back then. So I say all that to say, after the Ransom insurrection in Upper Marlboro, then there you see the formulation of men, militias, to patrol the roadways, and patrol the roadways in search of African American men who might have been patrolling those roadways to make sure that they had their proper papers on them. And that if you were to walk off your plantation, you had to have papers on you from your enslaver, or if you were a free man, papers to state that you were a free person. And if you were not, did not have your papers on you, then these militia could in turn penalize you, or quote unquote sort of put you in prison. And it's from there where we start to get the earliest kind of notation, I guess, of policing, so to speak, here in the United States. But the prison system was really a creation, honestly, of state government and federal government. The first prisons here in Maryland were created in the 1800s by the General Assembly. And really, at that time, they were engaged in manual labor at that time. And they were out and traveling out and about. But then later on, the General Assembly felt like, oh, we don't want necessarily the prisoners to be out and about amongst everyone else. And so we are going to create within the prison system workshops for them to learn various trades and skills while still within the confines of the prison system here in Maryland. And they provided goods and services to the commercial market, actually, initially here in Maryland. But then that was kind of seen as forbidden. And so they were left to providing goods and services solely to the state, which actually currently exists today. You have an agency called the Maryland Correctional Enterprise, which is part of the current Maryland system that makes our license plates here in the state of Maryland, and other goods, furniture that you will see in the dormitories at the University of Maryland, and other products that the state uses, including the desk and chairs that you see at the Maryland General Assembly, are all made by the Maryland Correctional Enterprise system. So that's my initial 2 cents, and so thank you.
Thank you so much. You know, in preparing for this, the topic, the arc of slavery to mass incarceration, I'm always interested in just like Delegate Williams, in the historical perspective. And I did just a little bit of reading at the website vera.org. And I just want to read a little bit from that to really set, I think, what we are going to talk about, and really how this is something that is with us, how prison systems started, why, and sort of where we are today. Nothing much has changed in terms of some of the issues that drive it. So this site says the year 1865, and we know that is when the Civil War ended, should be as notable to criminologists as the year 1970. While it marked the end of the Civil War and the passage of the 13th Amendment that Mr. Lawson referenced, it also triggered the nation's first prison boom when the number of Black Americans arrested and incarcerated surged. This was the result of state governments reenacting 2 powerful social forces. First, public anxiety and fear about crime stemming from newly freed Black Americans, and second, economic depression resulting from the war and the loss of free supply of labor. It goes on to really talk about it. It traces through the different eras in our American history, and always these competing narratives, whether it's for political gain. It talks about sort of during Jim Crow period, the narrative of being afraid of the Black man or crime as something associated with people of color. It always talks about sort of pitting the economic side of it, pitting jobs and loss of jobs, and this whole thing which drives the prison industry. It's an interesting read if you go to the Vera website, just as one place. Something else that I thought was interesting, and let me pull this up here really quickly, is one of the statistics, and I'm sorry I had it up. It's like typing in front of people, and you can never get it right. All right, here we go. In 1970, the state and federal prison population was 196,441. By 1985, it had grown to 481,616. And by the year 2008, federal and state correctional authorities had jurisdiction over 1.6 million people. So that's, what, 14 years ago? I don't do math. I'm a lawyer. We don't do math. And so it's really, really just talking about sort of this mass incarceration. One other thing that I thought was interesting. The incarceration boom fundamentally altered the transition to adulthood for several generations of Black men, and to a lesser but still significant extent, Black women and Latino men and women. By the turn of the 21st century, Black men born in the 1960s were more likely to have gone to prison than to have completed college or military service. I say all this to say, I don't have the answers for everything, but this is a discussion today. And I think it's an issue that, as I said, has been with us for hundreds of years. The last thing I'll say before we jump to the panelists is in a conversation with a neighbor of mine, a lovely man who also happens not to look like me, but he does have family members that look like me. And we don't agree with a lot of things politically, but we engage in conversation. We had a conversation, and sort of this came up about incarceration and the disproportionate amount of Black and brown folks in prison as a relationship to population. And so I asked him, do you think that Black people are inherently more criminal in nature? Like, I was trying to get at the root of what his thinking was. And he looked at me with a straight face and said, well, maybe. I'm thinking, did you just say that? Jimmy? We finished our conversation, but it's like, okay, so where's this narrative? But we know this narrative has been in our political and in our conversation for hundreds of years, because that was the wedge that was needed. So I just lay that as a foundation for our discussion, because it is nuanced and it is multi-complex. It really is. But I think that the numbers speak for themselves, and so what is the why? What is the it? Right? Why? So, I think to set the stage, I'd love to hear from each of our panelists. What was the purpose of prison?
What was the purpose of prison? You get as many answers as people you ask.
That's right.
In theory, a prison is to put people away who are offenders to the larger society. In alternate theory, it is a place of rehabilitation. I would suggest that the alternate theory to rehabilitate people is something to satisfy those who put people away to think that they're making an improvement in the society. You said a couple of things. Well, you said many things, all of which are true. But the word politics and the word economics, to me, are the underlying two things that cause the whole rest of it to fall in place. Whatever we had in 1865, at the end of the war, when we were passing the 13th Amendment, of course the 14th and 15th, on citizenship and the right to vote followed in close proximity. But that tone that was set then does not reflect the current situation now. We were not looking at the health crisis in which African Americans did not have the same access to the level of health. Economics, of course, has a relationship to access to employment, to be able to take care of one's family, to be able to satisfy the everyday needs. Education was not available. Education is very important psychologically. We put all of these things together, and what do? Bad behavior, we just lock them up. We lock people up, and then once they're in prison, we are not adequately treating them as far as health is concerned, as far as meaningful rehabilitation, and most importantly, and maybe there is no most importantly, a full complement of social services. It is not effective to say we need more police, we need more prisons, nor is it effective to say we need to defund the police. What we need to do is to reallocate available resources to really do a meaningful job of helping those who need the help. And as long as we continue to deny and hang on to that lock 'em up mentality, you're going to see the rising of the number of increased people being incarcerated. When you talk about how many people were incarcerated in year 1 and versus year 10 and year 20, you can see that prisons are big business. And that with the cash basis where people put people away and they pay private industries, the more people I put in prison, the more people, more money my corporation can gain. And then when we turn the people out, and that's what I mean, turn them out, as opposed to rehabilitating them, then we have done nothing but hurt ourselves. Prisons are too big, they need to be smaller. There need to be places where we can concentrate on helping people to help themselves. You teach a man how to fish, he or she will be able to learn how to become a fisherman. You just give them a fish, they're not going to get anything until what's for dinner. So I just want to pass it on, but I think that this is very important to understand that we are not approaching the system. I talked about the Brenner Institute, I talked about the United Nations, and also the Partners for Justice. These are all organizations that have addressed these same issues, come up with meaningful suggestions, which the state of Maryland is trying to tackle, but they're announcing it just today. Where were they 100 years ago? Where were they 50 years ago? Where were they 10 years ago? We're glad they're doing something, but it's going to be a long time before we get there, if we get there.
Thank you. So what is the purpose of prison? And I think that it's important that we distinguish between purpose and function. And I think that the purpose goes back to what our Honorable Delegate talked about earlier. I think that the original purpose was to have a system where you weren't burning people at the stake, because it's politically very uncomfortable. And at one time, the system that, the carceral system was really the envy of the world, because it was basically a timeout. You know, it's as opposed to cutting your hands off and, you know, and burning you at the stake, or hanging you. The idea was that we were going to give you a timeout, give you an opportunity to reflect. And there are a lot of the principles were these Quaker principles, right? And so there were a lot of countries that were following our model. This was all prior to the 13th Amendment, of course. And in fact, you know, the Canadian model is very similar to what the original idea of what the carceral system in the United States was. And then we had the 13th Amendment, which transmogrified the system into an excuse to continue the slave system. And that new creation, which was really, in a lot of ways, you know, kind of the brainchild, the brain trust was we're going to rehabilitate slavery by attaching it to this carceral system that is the envy of the world. And really what it did is really just destroyed the carceral system that was the envy of the world. And so the original purpose was laudable, right? We're not going to kill you because you committed a crime. But how does it function? And it has functioned really as a stimulus program, right? It's economic stimulus. It's economic stimulus for the places where the prisons are made. And the question is, what happens to the places where the prisoners are coming from? For those individuals, their right to self-determination, their right to a voice is extinguished. And so our carceral system is basically the growth over time of really a kind of fascism and police state. And we have to be careful that it doesn't metastasize and grow to the point where we lose our nation. And so I think that that's where we start. And I think we need to come up with ideas that adjust the incentives toward incarcerating more people, because as the incentives stand now, we have a very strong economic incentive. We have an incredibly strong political incentive, because if you incarcerate a person, they can't vote. And now you've moved all of the resources, according to census data, to this new spot. So even if it's not your intention to create an environment where you've got congressional districts that are based on prisons, that is the outcome. And so what we need to do is we need to change the incentives both economically and politically. And I think that that will help us to possibly return the purpose to its original purpose and break the current function.
And I would love to hear whether what you're talking about, Mr. Lawson, is also reflective in Maryland. I'm not sure it is, but we can break that down. Yeah.
And I can probably add a little context in terms of the profitability of the prison system. Maryland isn't like other places across the country where we have for-profit
Right.
prisons and things like that. The Maryland prison system is a function of the state through the State Department of Corrections, and every county has their own local prison system in the sense of holding cells for individuals who are about to face trial and things like that. So all of those are constructs of the state. The one good thing, we don't have that here in Maryland, but there is still a profitability associated with our prison systems here in Maryland, whether you're talking about if someone's on house arrest, they have to pay for their ankle monitoring systems here in the state of Maryland. If you are incarcerated and wish to make a phone call, you have to pay for those phone calls. If you are, different services that you might want to have, you have to pay for those. And so a lot of times when people come out of prison, they're also saddled with debt that they owe to the state of Maryland because of these charges that they had against them that required them to have to also pay for certain things. The one good thing is that we're trying to remove a lot of those barriers. I've been approached, Senator Jeff Wallstreicher, who's the vice chair of the Judicial Proceedings Committee, has introduced a bill previously, plans on reintroducing it, wants me to be the crossfile on removing the fees for the phone calls in our prison system here in the state of Maryland. There have been legislation in the past to try to remove the charges for the ankle monitoring systems here that are state and also county facilities charge to individuals. And so we're slowly trying to get that out of our prison system here in the state of Maryland. The one good thing we've also done is to try to increase opportunities for formerly incarcerated individuals to participate in our political process. And so those who've been convicted with a misdemeanor here in Maryland, once you've finished your time of incarceration and parole, you can register to vote here in Maryland. Only those who have been convicted of a felony, that is still on the books here in Maryland. They're still unable to vote, is my understanding, but we are working on trying to remove all of those barriers and things like that. So
That's interesting because when we met to discuss this program, I shared with the other panelists that as a public defender, I remember looking up and seeing that my clients who maybe had been found guilty of, say, felony theft, which then was anything over, I think, $1,500, $1,500 was a felony, I believe.
yeah.
And that they weren't able to vote for the rest of their lives. And I actually thought, so I'm glad you've answered, I thought that had changed. So if it also includes felonies that are economic style, it's a little shameful. And this is a former prosecutor speaking, right? Because I think that, you go to prison and you serve your time and you come out, and I think it's for all of us, for society, it is best for all of us that returning citizens have the same economic chances, that they can be part of the whole society in terms of voting, have their voice heard. So yeah, it really does bear looking at. And I think a lot of what happens in the law is driven by us, what we determine we want our society to look like, what we determine public policy should be. And so I just dropped some food for thought. There's something I wanted to say before I ask the next question. And during my limited research, I did come across in the 1940s where, again, there was always this struggle, right? Economics and politics. And when we started having increased immigration, and then you started having immigrant population, and so now prison was not only black folks, but now it was poor folks that weren't black and immigrant. And then in the 40s was this great social awareness of how we need to reform, and we we need to rehabilitate, and we need to be kinder. And so this is when prison reform started. But what the Vera site says is that it wasn't for black folks that were in prison, right? You couldn't, because it was supposed to be for those that they thought were, I don't know the word, you know, that they were deemed worthy of this rehabilitation. So it is interesting. So, okay, so if our title is The Arc of Slavery to Mass Incarceration, as a lawyer, I always want to define terms, right, so that we all understand. So I'm very curious and interested how each of you, or what you think mass incarceration means and is.
Since we seem to be going in the order which was seated, I'll take that. Mass incarceration, pre-Civil War, pre-13th Amendment, mass incarceration, of course, was, as we said before, is focused on you do the crime, we lock you up. But it got worse after we passed the 13th Amendment, because the 13th Amendment's provision had what today we would call an unintended consequence. When they adopted it, I don't think obviously they weren't thinking about what was going to come out of it and how it would subsequently be interpreted. That term of art, if you want to call it that, in the 13th Amendment was a foundational statement that would allow us to imprison potentially or separate out from the general community of the general population anyone whose conduct was deemed to be undesirable for whatever reason, whether it became because of school truancy, whether it became because you stole something, and what did you steal? Whether it became you assaulted somebody, and how much did you assault them? Of course, an assault is an assault. And it gave freedom to an interpretation that allowed all sorts of things to happen. Consequently, as the Brennan Institute looked at it, and my classmate from law school, and my goodness, I'm getting old, I gotta remember his name. As he said, he was part of the problem. And he's a federal judge right here from the state, and my glasses and I aren't catching his name. But he pointed out the fact that so many of the crimes, punishment, did not fit. It was excessive in terms of the criminal action laws adopted at the federal level, criminal laws adopted at the state level, led to more incarceration of people that should have been incarcerated for longer a period of time than they should have been incarcerated. Alex Williams, that's what it is, for the particular crime. And the fact that there was so much disproportionality within the racial mix-up. And he was focusing on this, speaking about African American in particular, disproportionality in terms of the length of sentences. All of these are avenues to increase the percentage of incarceration, which also removes those so-called undesirable people who happen to be black, brown, maybe Native American, from the community at large, thereby leaving the other population, which we don't say white, but we mean it, to be able to make certain decisions about what they're going to do and what they're not going to do, and where those people that have had their civil rights removed, as was referenced, they are in the mix in that they are located in the state, but they have no say in the decision of the matter. And now, just this week, I mentioned from the Washington Post, they announced, and this is through Anthony Brown, of course, with the governor's agreement and consent, that they have established what is being referred to as an equal justice collaborative partnership. You may have heard about it. The Equal Justice Collaborative Partnership, and they're going to address certain issues, all related to reducing mass incarceration, including poorly funded community diversion programs. That's very important. Social services at every level, inadequate reentry programs, racial bias in sentencing. That's what I just talked about. Criminalization of black men by the media, and impacts imposed by the 1994 National Crime Bill and other federal crime bills. These are all incarceration related. So when we talk about incarceration, we have to ask ourselves, who are these people? How did they get here? What did they do in relation to what somebody else did that caused this person to get a slap on the hand or a 10-day or 2-month sentence, and this person did the same thing to get a 2, 4, 6 years? We're not talking about releasing murderers in the street, but we are talking about examining how we apply the overlay so that we put ourselves in a position where we lock people up, but we don't prepare them while they're there to return, and we don't prepare them at every step along the way to gain an economic stronghold for their families. So this just perpetuates it. Dad is in prison, the family is deprived, they're not getting any money from his labor, and then that just engenders the next generation to continue. So the level of incarceration is a very broad description, because psychologically, those of us who are affected are incarcerated, whether we're behind bars or not.
Thank you. So mass incarceration, what is it? I think that we can look to the fact that we have more individuals incarcerated today, right now, and that includes the individuals who are on home arrest, than were ever slaves at any one time. That's massive. And the question is, how did we get there? And I think that we've gotten there in fits and starts. And I think from my experience, the most recent fits had to do with the crack cocaine epidemic in the 1980s and 90s. And during that period, we got a lot of talk from both sides of the political aisle about truth in sentencing. And so we got a lot of talk about truth in sentencing in the federal system that bled over into the state systems. And we started to see more efforts to co-opt our young people, our children, into the system, creating that school-to-prison pipeline. And I think that we can describe mass incarceration as really a very powerful incentive structure. And the question is, why should we all care, right? Because we talked about, who's most affected. But just because, you're a canary in a coal mine, it doesn't mean that you as the worker won't be affected too, right? If we think about the opioid crisis, the number of individuals who are not Black, who are wrapped up into this opioid crisis, are also being affected by the carceral system. We are talking about felonies, right? The President of the United States has a son who got wrapped into that entire system. And so this is a story that's coming to all of us. And so we need to work as a community to figure out how we're going to redress it.
Thanks. Two things. One, I wanted to kind of clarify my last comment because I'm anyway, my glasses. So when I say convicted of a felony while they're incarcerated, they're not eligible to vote.
Oh, God.
While they're incarcerated. Okay. So I wanted to clarify that. I apologize. So yes. But in terms of mass incarceration, I just simply think of it as and this was already mentioned, a disproportionality of people who are incarcerated versus their ratio as part of the population. And so here in Maryland, African Americans make up about 30 to 35% of the population, but as was stated by the judge earlier, they make up roughly about 75% of the incarceration system here in Maryland. And I think that's where I would define that as mass incarceration, where the representation of the population within a local jurisdiction does not equal, and it actually is in excess of their representation within the incarceration system. And so, I'm not gonna get into the the background of the 13th Amendment. I feel like my role is more kind of to enact the policies that those who are much smarter than me feel as though need to be addressed to remove that or reverse that tide. But yeah, that's kind of how I see it.
So again, just looking back historically, and we all know this, that right after the Civil War, across the South, right, because the 13th Amendment had been passed, and that one loophole was, unless criminal conduct, right, that all of these laws were passed, and I'll just read it straight from the era. All across the South, black codes were passed that outlawed behaviors common to black people, such as walking without a purpose, or walking at night, hunting on Sundays, or settling on public or private land. So there are analogies. There are analogies to today. We talked a little bit about the effect that this has on all of us as a society. And I want to delve a little bit now into sort of the trauma and that intersection with mass incarceration and what it does to communities and families and to society. I read there about, that if you were an African-American male born in the 1960s, you have, a couple of generations that just disappeared. That affects all of us, not just if you have a family member. That affects all of us as a society. So I'd love to hear through each of your lens, your views and what you think about this. And should we care?
Yeah, I think
It's on, yeah.
Yeah, the trauma I think is very real, and I see this all the time in Annapolis when we have various pieces of legislation that is addressing either the incarceration or the after incarceration ways to reduce recidivism, whether we're talking about expungements or job opportunities and things like that. And the individuals who testify before our committees, you can see the trauma that they have, whether it's a person who had been incarcerated themselves or a family member of someone who had been incarcerated. And, I always say our committee, I always describe it as the workhorse of the General Assembly, but we really are kind of also the soul, I think, of the General Assembly in the sense of the issues that we deal with really are the issues that touch people's souls, and you really do get to understand the true sense of people on the committee that I serve on. And so that trauma is directly affected to the individuals, to their immediate families, but then also I think indirectly to the individuals who interact with them every day. I mean, I know that their trauma affects us on our committee, and the emotional toll that it takes on us, the emotional toll that it takes on individuals who serve within our prison system. But I think you were also trying to get more globally about the toll that it takes on society. And you can look at just simply the sheer numbers, the loss of economic revenue that results when you have individuals who are not paying into our society, the toll that it takes on their children, and then their children are part of our public school system, and then the trauma, the way that they manifest that trauma, whether they're in school or outside of school. And when you're young, you don't necessarily know how to deal with that trauma. And so that manifests itself, whether it's emotional behaviors, criminal behaviors that are exhibited by those individuals because of the emotional trauma that they are unable to understand how to process because of the trauma that is going on in the home and things like that. And so we see these manifest themselves in a number of different ways within our society. And so the question is, should we care? Yes, we should definitely care, because at the end of the day, it's affecting all of us, whether it's affecting us financially and the taxes that we have to pay, whether it's affecting our sense of safety within our communities. We're all paying in some kind of fashion, form, or another, so.
Thank you. I think that
Yeah, it's
I think that trauma is, I think that that is an important element that we need to tackle. It's probably one of the most important elements that we need to tackle because it's part of the cycle that brings us back to this place again and again and again. And I guess I continue to go back to the 80s when we were kind of emptying out our mental health, state mental health organizations, hospitals. We really eliminated long-term care. And we took those individuals and we said, well, we are going to now incarcerate you. And incarceration is, it is a stigmatization as well of mental illness. And if we don't deal with the mental health crisis, the mental health crises will deal with us. And that is what we are seeing. We have decided to use prisons as a proxy for every societal ill. Our social safety net has now become prison, right? And so it's more of a social safety net that acts like a spider web where you fall on and you can't get off. And it is affecting everyone. You think about what happened during the pandemic and the number of crime, how crime increased during the pandemic, and much of it had to do with a degradation in community, right? People no longer felt connected to their families, their surroundings, because we were all trapped in the house. And so it really kind of magnified for us what the problem with incarceration is, because it's isolating, right? There were so many individuals who needed therapy after the pandemic because they were isolated. Now think about that writ large within the carceral system, where these individuals are not just isolated from their families, they're isolated from society and basically pitted against each other. It's a training program for more dysfunction. And so we need to not just consider trauma, we need to treat it. That is going to be a key function that we need to enact, that we need to engage to fix this problem.
I couldn't agree more with both of you. Trauma affects us at every phase of our existence. While we're in the prison, trauma affects us with the people we interact with in the prison itself. And I know all the prisons try to supposedly separate the most violent from the least violent. Violence occurs, and the atmosphere in which the prison operates is not rehabilitative as far as the trauma affecting psychologically those who are on the edge of losing it, those who have lost it, to get it back. But I'm going to take this a little place different. After I retired being a senior administrative law judge for the District of Columbia, because of my family's history, I created an organization called the Quander Historical Society to identify, preserve, document, and protect the legacy of African American history. And that morphed into something else. It morphed into my becoming a licensed certified tour guide. And as a licensed certified tour guide, one of the main things I do is take student groups on college tours. If you know where I'm going, I go to college tours, and there is a serious problem in the African American historical black colleges and universities. There are not enough black men on these campuses. Where are they? Psychologically, too many of them. No father in the home. Broken family structure, which I know subconsciously because I don't want to get into people's intimate business and embarrass anybody. I know it's related to the fact that the father, because it creeps out sometimes, he's in jail. And he's there because of a crime, and it may not have been that serious of a crime. He's there because of some domestic violence he may have committed against the mother out of frustration, trauma-related, drug-related, alcohol-related, created all sorts of dysfunction. I'm sitting right here in Washington, D.C., a stone's throw from Howard University, which is my alma mater. 72% of the enrollees at Howard are female. I just did a tour over at Morgan. I forget the percentage, but it's like 69 or 71%. I did one at Hampton, 68%. I did one at Bowie, about the same number. This is an effect of the trauma that we are creating for the next generation. Until we can find an opportunity to help our young men, and some of them are not so young, even the older ones. I work with, as a volunteer, Omega Men. I'm a member of Omega Sci-Fi. We have a great mentoring program, Omega Men Meet Homeless Men. And we are focused on older men, not teenagers, but older men, many of whom are in the prison or were in the prison system, to try to deal with the everyday traumas that they need to get that commercial driver's license so they can get a job, so they can contribute to the support of their families, so they can get back into a reasonable relationship with their families that has been taken away because of domestic relation violence, which is trauma. So trauma is something that is endemic to our very existence. And until we are able to tackle it in all phases where it is, the situation is not going to significantly improve. So we are sitting here, so we know this, we're preaching to the choir in that sense, but we have to be able to reach out to those who are the victims, and they can be the 18, 20-year-old person who's trying to struggle to get through without a man in the house, without a father figure, without a father who has contributed to the family support. This is all the next generation of dysfunctionality that we are facing, and unless we face it and face it head up and do something about it, it's not going to get any better.
Yeah, I know that the three reasons that we were taught in law school and in practice for sentencing is or incarceration, right? Rehabilitation. But I think we can be honest that there's not a whole lot of rehabilitation going on. It's more warehousing. Punishment or deterrence. And so I think it's a question we have to ask ourselves, like, what do we as a society want? And I do know that, and Mr. Lawson touched on it, there are other countries that have, and of course, you know, they're smaller, so perhaps it's easier to have sort of reform, but there are other cultures, I think in Scandinavia, I don't remember which country in Scandinavia, but their whole prison model is different. And the recidivism rate is low, and of course there isn't over-policing and, you know, the incarceration, but it really is aimed at, as a society, what they want, and when returning citizens are back, that there's not, you know, there's a safety net, there has been training, there has been, and it is not warehousing, and it is not a sort of treating people with less than dignity or with basic rights, civil or human, and in fact some of them, and again, I'm just throwing this out. When we started, I said I don't have the answers, but I think it's something for all of us to think through. On some of them, they actually don't even look like prisons, right? They're like campuses. So I think that's a question for us. What is it that we want it to look like? Do we just want punishment? Fine, throw the key away. But then we have to think about how it affects us as a society. And is that really something that's beneficial for all of us? A couple of things, areas I want to touch on, and then I would love to hear if there's anything we haven't talked about that you want to talk about, and then I'd love to include all of our audience. But we touched a little bit on it, but let's talk about that school to prison pipeline. What is it? Is it grooming? Do we care? How do we stop it if we care? If we don't care, then, you know, what do we think is the end result? Or anything I haven't asked that you want to talk about, the school to prison pipeline.
The school to prison pipeline. I would postulate that it actually is grooming. In fact, I would use a different term than grooming. So our school system is really based on kind of the Industrial Revolution, the growth of the Industrial Revolution, right? We wanted to have individuals who could operate on the assembly line. The school system as it stands today is all about creating individuals who are consistent and who can put out a consistent product every time. And to the degree that we criminalize children, we are creating an environment, a training program, if you will, for our prison system. And we have school resource officers. I think that one of the things we thought about when we were creating these school resource officers were that we needed to have greater safety in the schools. But these school resource officers aren't in every community. Where do we have more school resource officers? It's in primarily more urban areas, primarily more areas where you have a larger number of minorities. And what is the purpose? What happens to students once they get caught into this system, right? You know, when I grew up, you know, in the 80s, you know, if I got into a fight in school, this is before there were school resource officers. If I got into a fight in school, then there was a call to my mom. And that's the last thing you want is for mom to show up, you know, at the school. And that was a deterrent, because we know that jail truly is not a deterrent, because we've got the growth of mass incarceration that tells us that this is not a deterrent. The more people we lock up, the more people we wind up locking up. So in terms of the school to prison pipeline, if you get into a fight in school, now you have a higher likelihood that there will be police involvement. And what happens when police become involved, particularly in the inner city? You get escalation, and escalation leads to incarceration for the individual who is involved, or it may lead to their death. And so from that standpoint, I wouldn't necessarily call it grooming, but I would say it is training.
Or normalizing.
We're normalizing.
Yeah. When I think about that, you know, some schools have probation officers on campus. Why should that be normal in a school? I don't understand it.
The very term probation officer sets the tone. You don't have a probation anything unless you have been previously, at least in the mind of some, adjudged as having committed something, regardless of what the something is. There's no easy solution at all. I'm firmly of the opinion that prison is not a deterrent. If prison is a breeding ground for further crime, misunderstanding, and inability to get along with other people in circumstances. What they're doing and have done in Scandinavia, while I haven't studied it carefully and not all that familiar with it, I know it works much better, because the aim of prison in the first place, on paper, but not the way it's executed, is to reduce crime by rehabilitating people. That's the recited aim. But that's not what's happening. And school to prison pipeline is a feeder ground. If you go into any number of schools here, all over the United States, I'm not going to dwell on a particular school here in Prince George's County or in Washington, D.C., but we know which schools, in many cases, have these consistent problems. And I think it's being tackled at the wrong end. And we do perhaps need some adult supervision in the schools. But we have to deal with getting the children to understand that they're there for a purpose. And I feel, as hard as the teachers are working, that of course a lot of the problem is in the home. when there's no father in the house, and of course the mother's doing a great job, but she's a woman and she's a mother, she's not a father. So I am a strong believer in two-parent homes, but I'm being realistic also. The reality of the situation is that's not the way it is in too many of our cases. But we definitely have got to tackle this particular issue and be more child-friendly, unless probation line next step is the jailhouse by way of juvenile detention avenue. That is not going to work.
So talk about the school to prison pipeline. I know that's like a term of art that we've used for so many years. I kind of want to get away from the term because I think it's not just school. I think it's a societal to prison pipeline, to be quite honest with you. And I think we have more individuals, especially younger individuals, who I would call are justice impacted, meaning they know someone who has touched the justice system, have been impacted by the justice system, or they've been impacted themselves by the justice system, or the justice system being incarcerated is being glorified in certain parts of our society. And so it's a mindset behavior that isn't just because I go to school and I see the school resource officer, or I see they don't call them metal detectors anymore. I forget what they call them now, but they're metal detectors. Like, just say what they are. They're metal detectors in the schools. I think it's more than just that. I think it is you've been impacted in some way, and now this system is being glorified as something that it's not shameful to be a part of anymore. And I think that's the piece that we really need to get at, where you have young people who see it as a badge of honor to have been incarcerated, a badge of honor to have been arrested or not be a snitch about who is really committing the crimes within their community. And so you have young individuals who are just as impacted, not necessarily just at school, but at school and at home and in their recreational activities. I think that's what we're seeing, and therefore we're seeing this increase of incarceration because there's no longer this stigma associated with incarceration anymore amongst our young people. So that's shifting the paradigm a little bit, but that's just kind of how I see it. So
Yeah, so the question is, what to do about it, if anything, right? What do we want?
that is a
society.
$1 million
What
question.
do we want?
We always ask ourselves.
Nothing is not an option.
Correct.
Well, especially given the Washington Post today, so numbers speak for themselves, but it comes back to that question I had of my neighbor. What do you think is driving it? He wouldn't acknowledge that, perhaps it is a holdover from our history. Or even acknowledge that perhaps there is over-policing, which sometimes is a holdover from our history. And so, what is driving it? And that's why I asked him point blank, then, do you think that we, as Black people, have some special gene that makes us, I mean, it's a ridiculous question, but I meant it ridiculous, but I was surprised at his response.
I mean, no, there isn't a special gene or anything like
course.
that.
Pigmentation of your skin does not,
Right, does not automatically mean that you're more susceptible to commit crime. That is the $1 million answer, and I see my colleague here in the audience, Delegate Karen Tolles, who also serves with me on the Judiciary Committee in Annapolis, and I think that's the question we're always asking ourselves. What can we do, at least from our vantage point as legislators, to try to fix this problem? I mean, part of it is policy enactments. I mentioned some of the policies that we're trying to enact to remove the fees and more of the harms that are associated with incarceration. But maybe what you talked about earlier with some of the things, I think it's Denmark and some of the other places in Europe, the way that they approach incarceration, one of the things our county executive, she used to be a state prosecutor, talks about is how the majority of the individuals who are within our incarceration system either have a mental health issue or a drug dependency or alcohol dependency. Or all of the above, yes, or all of the above. And so when you have a population that is coming into an institution that already has all of these things going on, and you're not treating those things that are going on, then how do you expect them to come out of that institution to be productive members of society when they still have those mental health issues, they still have that drug dependency, they still have that alcohol dependency, or all of the above? And so I think when we try to move to a system where we are talking about rehabilitation, when we are putting measures in place to treat those things that may be part of the causation, not maybe the total cause, but part of the cause as to why there are seeking avenues to engage in criminal activity as opposed to seeking a job or something else and other activity. I don't think you can expect them to become productive members of society, not to recidivists, and when they come out, because they're still dealing with those same issues that they had when they went in.
So, I know we talked about the difference between, kind of the point of mass incarceration versus its function. I do think that mass incarceration as it stands today, because it has, in a lot of ways, acted as a stimulus for the economy of a particular subset of the population, who is basically the population who is who is on a separate rung, right? Who is on a higher rung, because really what we've got is a caste system. And so mass incarceration is the point. We need to accept that that is part of the point. Part of the point is, how do we continue to retain our caste system? How do we continue to have, after the end of the Rust Belt, right? When you had all these great jobs evaporate. And so what do you get in its place? You get a prison, which is a city. And cities need infrastructure. And so now you've got individuals to build the city for you. You've got plumbers, you got carpenters, you got every trade is involved in the prison system. And so you really have a very powerful incentive to continue to build prisons. But it's an incentive for a particular subset of the population, right? And that subset, I know we think about it from the standpoint of complexion, but really, it's about money. This is about money. And the dichotomy that we see between groups, individuals who are identified as white, individuals who are identified as black, these are fractures that are intended to keep people with like circumstances apart. And so long as we make this assumption that based on how much brown melanin you've got in your skin is a determining factor in terms of where you stand on the social strata, then we're going to continue to have the growth of this system which is destroying our society. We talked a little bit about what are some of the reasons that we have the growth of mass incarceration and the difficulties that our teachers have in the schools. And one of the things that I don't think we've discussed is that what we've got is a real disintegration of community around us. We think about mom and dad as being the end-all, the be-all and end-all pinnacle. And the truth of it is that two young people in their 20s don't know what the hell they're doing with a bunch of kids. They don't, and they never did. There was what they call allo-parenting, right? You had other people in the community You had grandma was there, granddad was there. And all of that structure, in a lot of ways, has been upended. And if we want to rebuild community and decrease the degree to which we have antisocial behavior, you've got to bring back our parenting. You've got to bring the community back. Because I'm gonna tell you, when I was walking home from school, it wasn't grandma or my mom who was hitting me in the head of all the neighbors, you know, who was saying, what were you doing? And my mom heard about it before I got there. And so it is that community that we have lost that we need to reinvigorate. And now I know this is kind of maybe nibbling around the edges, but there are incentive changes that we can make to our system to make it less palatable to incarcerate people. One of the things that we need to think about are, you know, the two basic pillars I think we need to think about. We need to think about the economic power associated with the prison system. And then we also need to think about the political power associated with the prison system, right? And as we consider the incentive structures, those are the places where we need to make adjustments, because that brings us back to public policy, right? And one of the things that we can think about is, well, you know, in our system, and even in Maryland, we go back and look at what the Maryland Code says about the requirement to work in prisons. It is mandatory. What the code says is that it is the policy of the state that because of the enforced idleness of inmates, it is necessary and desirable that useful work on projects in the state be found for inmates and those inmates who may be used safely for maintenance, construction, or reconstruction projects shall be assigned to that work. It is mandatory. Now, while it is mandatory, and the 13th Amendment says that you can make it mandatory, the 13th Amendment does not say that you don't pay them. It does not say that. And so, from that standpoint, there are a few things that we can do, right? We can go back to legislative change and say, we are going to pay them. We can say that in our statutes. In Maryland, we can do that, right? And that helps to break that cycle that, you know, if you've got to pay the prisoners the going rate,
Right, because
If
they
you
might
gotta-
get paid, but it's not the
that's
going
right.
rate.
But if you got to pay them the going rate,
$2 an hour.
yes, exactly. Even if you had to pay a minimum wage, right? That breaks some of that economic hold. Not only, and so that's, I think, the legislative piece. But you can look at it from the standpoint of litigation, right? Now, there are lots of several cases in several different states. I don't think there have been any cases in Maryland as of yet, where litigants have brought cases litigants who were prisoners brought cases based on violations of the Fair Labor Standards Act, right? And those challenges have primarily failed. And one of the reasons why those challenges failed was that what judges said was that, well, there's no employer-employee relationship between the prison and the prisoner. And they're right. There isn't one. However, the prison, in a lot of ways, is much more like a guardian or conservator. In the prison system, the prison holds, the state holds the property of the prisoner in trust. It is a fiduciary relationship. And one of the worst things that you can do as a fiduciary is for the property of the ward to end up in the pocket of the guardian. And that brings us back to, so from that standpoint, and understanding that the 13th Amendment eliminates chattel slavery in that there are still rights associated with the prisoner. If we look at it from the standpoint that the relationship between the incarcerated person and the state is really much more of a guardian to ward circumstance, then I think that we can better understand how the state should comport itself as it pertains to that ward. It is well established in the law that a guardian should not hold the wages of the ward. In fact, the guardian generally would have no control over the wages, specifically wages of the ward, as opposed to the personal property of the ward. And so, to the degree that the state is excising a portion of that, of those wages by only paying a pittance, then the state is violating not only the 13th Amendment, it's violating the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. And so you can make that argument, and I haven't heard that argument made before, and so it's another thing that we could do.
Yeah, and the thing about it, everything that you're saying is absolutely correct. The paradigm has to change. We are in a situation now in this country driven by the almighty dollar and driven by the fact that those who are in charge, it's his story. So whoever he is writing the history, and whoever he is, not even her, is controlling the paradigm as it develops. Let's face the fact, we are in a society in which incarceration is one of the major businesses of the United States at all levels of the economy. If we did not have that, the economy would be very different. I'm not going to say it would crumble, because it wouldn't. It would be very different. And until we can get to a point, and I don't see it happening with the current Supreme Court or anything time like this in my lifetime, where they tackle that issue and make such a finding, the atmosphere to make a finding of that nature based upon some of the arguments that Wade has put forward has not been entertained and will not be entertained with the current court, and perhaps not any time in the near future. But I think that with the groundswell of dissatisfaction that's coming up inside of many of the states, Maryland in particular, it's going to take an action perhaps coming more from the state level than the federal to get for the states to create a crescendo of opinion where we're going to look at this issue and say, what have we done, and more importantly, what have we failed to do? When I go into the Museum of African American History and Culture, and I go to the prison guard station at Angola, which is right next to the segregated railroad car, and Emmett Till's casket, I tell the people looking at that guardhouse, so that's a real guardhouse, and the people who were watched from that guardhouse are real prisoners of the state of Louisiana. I don't know what the hourly wage is now, but up until quite recently, they were compensated at 25 cents an hour. Now, that gets around the fact of slavery without compensation. But what can you do earning 25 cents an hour? What is that going to do to help your family? We need to have a situation, and this is just one of the little pieces, fair wages in the prison, going to determination some beneficiary of those wages. I don't mean the prisoner himself, maybe, but that prisoner, let's say it's a man, that prisoner may have a wife or a common law wife or a significant other. That prisoner probably has some children. That prisoner's family is being traumatized by loss of income, which also forces them into lower income housing, puts them into situations where they are traumatized, having to deal with other people who are in a similar or same circumstance. When they go to the school, they don't see the value of how this arithmetic class or me teaching or taking French is going to help me do anything with my life. I need money. Mom needs to survive. I can't survive. I don't have anything to eat. If it weren't for the school lunches, I wouldn't get any breakfast, wouldn't get any lunch, and wouldn't have a snack to take home for dinner. This is how our society is being totally traumatized, at these levels. And the prison system, in its way, people try to divorce these things and say, well, that's over here, this is over here. No, it is not. This is all tied together. And as African Americans, we know we live this every day. We are not separated from the trauma of thinking that because I live uptown or I graduated from law school, we all know, whether we want to admit it or not, there, but for the grace of God, go us. And when we go down there and deal with these Omega men meet homeless men and Omega men feed homeless men, this is the philosophy we take into this, there, but for the grace of God. Because any one of us could be interchangeable with one of them. Just because I took this instead of that, just because I took something that didn't belong to me, or because I took a drink or I smoked something I shouldn't have, or I injected a drug that I shouldn't have, has put me into the same position. And psychologically, African Americans, we know this as a group, and this is one thing, it's very difficult to communicate to some of the white population. They don't understand the trauma that we carry collectively. I look at these older settled ladies, maybe some of you young ones would know, but when we were growing up, every time there was a crime committed, what did we say? I sure hope they're not colored. We didn't say black. I sure hope they're not colored. Because we carry the baggage of anything that one of us did. My wife and I were just saying today about when we saw the man in Maine card who killed all those people. And we talked to one of our friends, and she said, well, he was in Maine, but was he black? We said, no, he was not. She said, I'm sure glad he wasn't colored. I said, I didn't think they said that anymore. We're locked into that. So we must learn to lift others as we climb. That's why I think you're a Delta. You're a Delta. I saw that. Right there on the campus of Howard University, they have a statue of wisdom. And it's a beautiful lady, and she's doing this hand up and a hand down. And I tell my students when I take them to Howard, I said, this is what the Divine Nine's all about. You've got to learn to lift others. Bring somebody with you as you yourself climb. Now, I know that sounds rather generic and ethereal in this conversation, but it's the absolute truth. We have got to get our legislators wherever they are to legislate these changes, and we ourselves have got to support them to make so these changes come. Because unless we help ourselves, we'll be very naive to think that somebody is going to pick up our story and help us if we don't do it ourselves. Now, we have a very strong group of people who are doing it, but certain things we cannot get done without some assistance from those who are in charge. So we must lobby and reach out to our state delegates, our county delegates, wherever they are, our congressmen and women, to change these issues. These are real issues, these are bread and butter issues. And we're up against some of the most economic bullheads in order to get these things through. And it's not going to be easy, but believe me, perseverance in the end movement, believe me. And this was something that Paul Lawrence Barr said in one of his poems about perseverance will be king.
Yeah, so, we started off a little bit about talking about this whole construct, right, that it's driven, if we look back and up until today, politics, rhetoric, economics, and this struggle and this clashing and pitting people off. But I still ask the same question. What do we as a society want? What do we want it to look like? What benefits everyone? And I'll just give two phrases, because I think, we are easily led by different narratives. What did we call the crack epidemic? We called it the war on drugs. We now call this the opioid epidemic. And it dictates the treatment of those caught up in it. And do not be fooled. Do not be fooled. There are lots of documentaries out there. I encourage you to Google and see the treatment. I can tell you when I was a public defender, when I finally got a client who had reached rock bottom in their addiction, right? And it doesn't matter how badly you as the family want or as the attorney wants and can see that it's the best thing, until that person recognizes that they really want the help. I would call around and find, and again, it was behavior that was being criminalized. The addiction was being criminalized, so I would call to find an alternative to jail. Different rehabilitation programs, and maybe they were in existence this one week. I would call 3 weeks later, they were already gone, right? It was out, right? But that's public policy. That's what we can demand. We can demand the funding. When each of our panelists talked about what drives perhaps some of the high population, yes, criminal activity occurred, but what is driving it is not that somebody is evil, although there are evil people that should be in jail. That's a given. I'm not talking about that. But when you talk about addiction and mental health and trauma and sometimes it is all wrapped up in one. What do we as a society want? Where do we want our money to go? And if we want it to go into prevention or to not having this revolving door. So, and so that's why I say, now people want to term it an opioid epidemic, because it has now reached different stratas of society that the war on drugs with the crack cocaine wasn't in. Everybody follow what I'm saying? And so it's real. And so we as citizens can demand what we want our society to look like and where we want our money to go and what we all can benefit from. So, what do you guys think? We would love to hear from you. Love to hear opposing views. Okay, well, he raised his hand first. Yes?
Who wanted to?
Right there behind the camera. Oh, okay. Oh, I'm sorry.
Hi, I'm Terrell. I just wanted to come back and kind of piggyback off of what he said about how a lot of black women are more so in college than black men. And also how black men are more incarcerated. Me coming from the younger generation, what I can speak about is the reason a lot of black men are in such harder places is because of toxic masculinity. That is a real strong thing. You have, I feel like my whole life I've heard people say oh, men aren't supposed to cry, men aren't supposed to feel, that makes them weak, that makes them pay, that makes them soft, makes them feminine. But it's we're all human beings, we're supposed to feel emotions. And over time, that can build up in a person's mind and make them go to things like alcohol or drug abuse or just act out all in crazy because they can't handle what's inside their mind. The mind is a very powerful place, so anything that could really antagonize how your think process is and how you see everything, it really can it's really hard. So it just comes out. You don't really know how to really handle yourself. And I feel now what the generation needs is just to know that it's okay to show emotions. It doesn't make you weak. If anything, it makes you stronger because you can face it head on. If you hold your emotion, it makes you weak because you can't talk about it. But yeah, that's all I wanted to say.
Thank you.
I realize this is the question. You're right. I realize this is the question to answer period, so I don't want to take too long. What you said about toxic masculinity is correct, but I personally believe, maybe they agree with me or not, if we had more male counselors or people interacting with these young men who have a false sense of masculinity, perhaps it would change their attitude and adjust to realize that certain things require sacrifice and postponement, like going to school to get your education so you can become a doctor, lawyer, Indian chief, or just a good citizen. So I believe that more male involvement, older men involved with younger men will help to smooth that out some.
Thank you.
Thank you, and you gave me a great segue because if anyone remembers way back, Oprah's Super Soul Sunday, and she had these interesting documentaries. There was a documentary called the Dhamma Brothers, D-H-A-M-M-A, where they brought in Vipassana meditation to work on the thinking and the circumstance that these men, black and white, were in, and they had to go through that for about a week, and they had to fight to keep the program. But what ended up happening was those men were changed drastically. The violence among those men went down. And so everything you all said had great value, but they're external. nothing so far has been said about the individual men and women in prison and working on those internal thought errors. I'm not enough, I'm not good enough, I'm too dark, because we still have a lot of colorism, which this, two of us worked at Oak Hill Youth Detention Center. So we have a child psychiatrist that worked with these kids, and I was the medical officer. So we have a little bit of understanding about what's going on, but certainly watching that Dama Brothers will give you some insight, and they shut that program down, administration did, even though they had evidence, they had data that there was a turnaround.
Thank you panel for bringing to the community this information and perspective. As you were speaking, my mind kept going to a phenomena that has developed over the years along with the system of incarceration of developing false evidence that's used to incarcerate people. And it's termed forensic science. A gentleman who's part of the Innocence Project has written a book, and it talks about how certain evidence is introduced into the process that is used to convict and believed to be science, but it actually is not. So I'm wondering, as attorneys, legislatures, how can you, as a community of concerned lawyers, deal with that kind of problem where police officers are given qualified immunity so they can do whatever they want to do and get away with it, and a lot of the evidence that's used to convict people and put them in prison in the first place is fake? And it's like, people just close their eyes. People who need to have their eyes open have their eyes closed. And so we get our young people incarcerated. The whole incarceration experience is traumatizing. I'm sure you've heard of Angola prison. And so one of the Angola 3 wrote a book that talked about how the young men, once they are admitted into the prison, are raped. That's sort of like the initiation. So, the whole system is set up to cause trauma. And can lawyers, judges do anything about the traumatizing of a person, keeping them incarcerated in isolation for 23 out of 24 hours? And this happened to one individual in Angola prison for 43 years, the longest time out of anybody in the world, right here in good old America. So I think we have, a lot of astute, informed, educated people, and I'm wondering about that community coming together. The Black community was destroyed years ago. I just think it was destroyed, and we can try, but it's really hard to go back. But we do have people like yourselves who are in a position, I believe, to impact the system, to do something about those false narratives that are out there.
Well, thank you for that comment. And I will say, I'm piggyback on something that Judge Quander mentioned about lobbying and being engaged in the political process. And I think that is super important. We've had proposed legislation in the past to get rid of qualified immunity in Annapolis. The bill fails every single year because the powers that be feel as though it is, for whatever reason, I'm not going to speculate as to why it fails, but it fails every single year. And so, I always tell people, if you want something passed, then the more people who speak out starts to get people's attention. Case in point, I think it was my first year in Annapolis, there was legislation that was proposed kind of in the middle of session to enact a sales tax on services here in the state of Maryland. So that would mean services that are provided by attorneys, accountants, other professionals, and things like that. I don't remember what day the legislation was introduced. There were so many people who had called Annapolis and so many people who emailed us. Literally, our email server that crashed because of the number of emails that we were getting from doctors, lawyers, accountants, everybody else who was enraged about this proposal. Our phones were ringing off the hook. And I think within 48 hours, that bill was pulled. 48 hours, that bill was pulled. And so people think, oh, the system is broken, like, oh, if I speak up, nothing's going to happen. If everybody speaks up, trust me, something will happen. Trust me, because multitudes of people speaking up also means for elected officials, multitudes of people who vote for us. And we respond to people who vote for us. And so if you want something changed, and I probably shouldn't say that, then get a number of 100,000 super voters to show up somewhere. Oh, people will start to pay attention.
Yep.
Because I've seen it happen. And so if you want that qualified immunity bill passed, then that's what needs to happen to the leadership in order to get something like that passed.
I do want to respond to part of your comment about false forensic evidence. And so I've been on both sides of this in the court, as a public defender and as a prosecutor. And I cannot speak about Louisiana or anywhere else, but I can speak about Prince George's County, did some practice in Montgomery County. And there are lots of things that go in to when a case is finally charged and prosecuted. And there are lots of checks and balances. But we also know that humans are involved in that as well. And so with humans come the characteristics of humans, whether it's truthfulness or not. And in every profession, there are truthful people and non-truthful people. So it's not a unique thing to law enforcement or police, right? We expect a higher standard of police, and the police department does what they can to weed out, and they have certain things that they do, right? But there are checks and balances that are required, and we are now, as we're seeing in this moment in time, where the police have been very silent in sort of that thin blue line until things start to erupt. And now we as a society and the court system is also saying that there is a responsibility as a police person to police yourself, and that you know who the troublemakers are, right? So we saw the beginning of this with the George Floyd murder and with the officers, like the first week on the job, and they all got held responsible, right? Because the culture was very militaristic, you follow your chain of command. But see, so that is now become, it's coming apart a little bit because we as society said that is unacceptable, right? So, in answer to your thing about forensics, so there are lots of things that go in, and forensic science is ever changing, ever evolving. And within the legal system, there are standards, and those are always litigated, and it has to be to a reasonable degree of scientific certainty, and what is acceptable now. And we know that as we go along, you look back and you realize that 50 years ago, that expert said that, and the science no longer supports it. So it's not a matter of fabrication. Sometimes it's just bad science. And bad science does have bad results that affect people. I think I want to respond to the narrative that all of it, because it isn't. And I can say that as a prosecutor, you take an oath, and there's also an ethical obligation. There's an ethical canon, rules in laws in the state of Maryland, and you're not allowed to take a case if you do not have enough evidence to prove it beyond a reasonable doubt. You're not allowed to take it and throw it up against the wall to see if it will stick. That doesn't mean that you don't have unethical prosecutors, but we have to weed those out, right? So I guess I take, not exception, but yes, there are issues. But I think that it erodes our system if we think that every case in court is false and that everybody's lying and that evidence isn't real. that there are checks and balances that go, and there are lots of efforts that go. But again, I acknowledge that as humans, we come with human personalities as well. And so, yes, you know, the liars are weeded out, maybe not before all of the damage is done, but there are internal functions that the public doesn't know about, you know, that you find out that somebody was a little bit not truthful or bent the truth a little bit, they go on a list and they're not called as a witness. And so sometimes that case falls apart because we can't charge it as a prosecutor, or that person, you know, that case is dismissed. Public may not know why, but because there are lists like, oh no, that officer does not have the ability, right? But there are internal functions that the police department has to work on, and the police, you know, they're given the names of the officers that are less than truthful. Like, do not, you know, so state's attorney's office will say, we have taken a stand, so do not, if that officer is in charge of that case or has anything, we're not calling them. So you need to determine what you're going to do with that officer, because essentially the state's attorney's office has said that that officer has no value. So are you going to put him on a desk or her on a desk, or what are you going to do? So there are checks and balances, and I just, you know, as prospective jurors, you know, for this to work, we have to not believe that everything is false and everybody's lying, because there are checks and balances and there is integrity within the system.
But you do have to have state's attorneys who are willing to do that. And not all state's attorneys
I
are
absolutely
willing to do that. I mean, I
agree.
know our state's attorney
Yes.
here in Prince George's County does
Yes.
that, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the one in Baltimore County
Agreed.
or other.
And so we, as society, have to hold that elected state's attorney feet to the fire. In other words, we have the control, we just don't, we have the power, we don't use it.
Yes, hello. Just want to thank you so very much for this forum, and thanks so much, Dr. Charles, for inviting us. We had some very interesting conversations on the Howard Yard for homecoming. HU? Okay. So I love the idea of the arc of slavery to mass incarceration, because we were talking about how for slavery, truly, if we reflect, it is post-traumatic slavery disorder, not just PTSD. And for our brothers and sisters who are on the continent, it's post-traumatic colonization disorder. So I agree with you, panelists. It is at the root cause of major issues with psychiatry and psychology and situations that needed to be healed at the core. So it is laughable for somebody to even think, or think, much less say that we have some sort of genetic code for any sort of behavior, right? That's a uninformed, uneducated person in that area. But we do need to take our time to really reflect, because we have other brethren, other parts of the humanity, like our Jewish brethren, they have really set a good example in saying, you will not forget what you've done to us in those 12 years. But brothers and sisters, this stuff has been done to us for centuries. So we must reflect and understand that we're amazing and resilient people, because with all of that trauma that we have gone through, missionaries meant to quote unquote help, but we know what they did, right? We must now realize, oh my goodness, where are we? We're so resilient. We're leading, we're fighting, and we must really appreciate who we are at the core and work hard just like you guys are. And thank you so very much. We're just so delighted to be here and be part of the forum.
And I think this will be the last, because we're going to wrap up.
Well, hi everyone. I'm a general pediatrician in PG County, and I also do addiction treatment. I jumped in when the adolescents started getting hold of those pills and different things, and I really wanted to know how to treat them. So I do that in this city part-time. But coming back to my main point, I'm speaking for the current parents. I'm 21 years a pediatrician. Parents are much more different now, very vigilant. So, and that's good. They want the old school. They want more oversight. So there's a lot more homeschooling now. And we are the largest group jumping into homeschooling. And they have co-ops. It's not like they're just home. They're in groups. And I have a lot of patients in that. And they're looking for resources. So that's one. And I really support that. And I do promote it because I think the schools right now are not supporting us. We need to be felt privileged and powerful and seen as positive people, and we don't get the reinforcement. And that's what the parents want.
So thank you. And I'm sorry, the lady with the scarf had your hand up for a long time.
I apologize, I
Oh,
just want
okay,
to
then
say
we'll pass it.
one short thing, and then I will pass it right to you. Something that, there's the saying, hurt people, but we never talk about, this country was based on people who were prisoners. And they were not whole. And so they create a country to make themselves feel better, but they couldn't do any better than what they were. And so this country is just based on that same mentality and brokenness and not enoughness. And all they can do is propagate what they learned. They can't go beyond where they were. And so this pain and trauma is not limited to those of us with a lot of melanin. It has to spread. And so we need to share the healing.
Thank you, ma'am. Great transition about sharing the healing. I'm very glad I had a few moments because I was about to go into my trauma zone on the discussion of forensics. And this pause gave me an opportunity to recollect from my kind of hyperventilation moment and to express appreciation for this amazing panel. I know I learned so much. But just to say, I think I had my own illustration of how that trauma can make it difficult to engage in dialogue. So I'm with the lady up front on forensics, and I also know what you're saying. Forensic professionals are professionals. It takes a few bad apples to destroy trust in the system. I started Googling in 2021, I think Maryland Attorney General report said that there were 5,800 untested rape kits. I know that's not what we're talking about, but it's relevant. Because when somebody hears 5,800 rape kits, that's 5,800 cases who were reported and taken evidence from. They are untested, people are not going to report. And it actually does link to incarceration because tragically, as everybody in this room knows, there have been so many cases of black men convicted of rape they did not commit. And it was DNA evidence that exonerated them after 10, 20, 25 years in prison. And so yes, the field is improving. And I will slow down now and get some water because but I got so mad and absolutely unable to hear the other point about, yes, forensics is a great science, but I'm like, 5,800 untested rape kits in Maryland alone. That's 5,800 victims, and who knows how many broken lives. That's right. Yes. And that's true for everything, not just rape kits. And that trauma that's how trauma looks like when people hyperventilate and lose the ability for rational dialogue, which I hope to regain. So thank you.
No, it was rational. Thank you. Well, it looks like we could talk forever, but I think we do need to wrap up. So Brooke, thank you for having us. Thank you.
Wow, thank you. What an amazing, inspiring discussion with this panel. I am so grateful that you all took the time out to share your experiences and ideas. And thank you for this great audience. We hope you'll come back on November 11th at our Creative Suitland site is our genealogy forum. And then in January, we'll have our history forum. Please feel free to hang out and discuss and keep the conversations going here and in your family and in our community. Thank you all so much.